The frost came early to Thornfield that year, biting through wool cloaks and settling into the bones of anyone unfortunate enough to be standing outside the baker's stall at dawn. Clara Winslow was one of those unfortunate souls, her basket empty, her gloves darned so many times they had lost their original color, her breath rising in pale clouds as she counted the coins in her palm for the third time, as though counting might somehow multiply them. It did not. 3 coins. That was all that remained of the household allowance her aunt had permitted her for the week, and 2 of them would need to go toward flour if there was to be bread on the table by Sunday. She tucked them back into her pocket and pulled her shawl tighter, glancing up at the grey sky as if it might offer some sympathy. It did not do that either. The market square was already crowded despite the cold, farmers calling out prices, a boy driving geese between the stalls, the smell of roasting chestnuts curling through the frozen air. Clara moved through it with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had learned, over 3 long years, that it was safer to be unnoticed than admired. Admiration invited questions, questions invited pity, and pity, she had discovered, was often crueler than contempt. She was reaching for a small twist of tea leaves, calculating whether she could afford it and still have enough for candles, when she saw him. He was crouched against the stone wall near the churchyard gate, half hidden by the shadow of the lich gate, a man in a coat so worn it had become the color of the wall itself. His hair was dark and overlong, falling across a face that should have been gaunt with hunger, but instead held something strange in it, a stillness, an alertness, as though he were watching the market rather than merely enduring it. His eyes, when they lifted and met hers, were a pale and startling grey, entirely wrong for a man dressed in rags. Clara looked away first. It was not polite to stare at a beggar, though most people in Thornfield did not extend him even that courtesy. They stepped around him as they might step around a puddle, their eyes sliding past as though he were furniture rather than flesh. She should have done the same. She had, after all, nothing to spare. But something in the set of his shoulders, proud, even in his poverty, refusing to slump the way most beggars learn to slump in order to appear pitiable enough for coin, caught at something in her chest. She recognized that posture. She wore it herself, most days, without knowing it. The posture of someone determined not to be pitied, even while being pitiable. She crossed the square before she had quite decided to. "You've had nothing today," she said, and it was not a question. The man's grey eyes flickered with something she could not name, surprise perhaps, or something closer to suspicion. "Nor tomorrow, most likely," he said. His voice was low, rougher than she expected, though it carried an odd precision to its words that did not entirely match his appearance. "Charity is a fashion, miss, and I am out of season." Clara almost smiled at that, despite herself. There was wit in it, a dry humor that poverty had not managed to crush out of him. She thought of her father, who had once said something very similar to her, in the last winter before his death, when the creditors had begun circling, and his own pride had refused to let him beg from friends who might have helped. She reached into her pocket without allowing herself to think too long about it, because thinking too long would have stopped her, and pressed her last coin, the very last one, the one meant for tea she now would not have, into his palm. "It isn't much," she said, feeling suddenly foolish, aware of her own worn gloves, her own thin cloak, the absurdity of a poor woman playing benefactress to a poorer man. "But it's what I have." The beggar looked down at the coin in his palm for a long moment, and something moved behind his grey eyes that Clara would spend weeks afterward trying to interpret and would not succeed in understanding until it was almost too late. "You cannot spare this," he said quietly. It was not a refusal, not quite. His fingers had already closed around the coin, but there was something searching in the way he said it, as though he were testing her, as though her answer mattered a great deal more than the situation warranted. "No," Clara admitted, "but you need it more than my tea does." She did not wait for his reply. She turned and walked back into the crowded square, her cheeks warm despite the cold, feeling the peculiar lightness that came from having given away something she could not afford, a lightness that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the strange, stubborn insistence of her own heart that kindness, once withheld too many times by the world, must be returned to it whenever possible, regardless of the cost. She did not look back. If she had, she would have seen the beggar rise slowly from his place by the churchyard wall, his grey eyes following her retreating figure with an intensity that no ordinary vagrant would have spared, for a woman who had given him nothing more than a single copper coin. She would have seen him turn the coin over in his fingers, as though it were made of something far more precious than metal. She would have seen, in the line of his jaw and the quiet authority in his bearing even beneath the rags, the shadow of a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than pitied, a man who had, for reasons of his own, chosen this disguise deliberately, and who had just discovered something in Thornfield's frozen market square that he had begun to believe did not exist at all. But Clara did not look back. She had bread to think of, and an aunt whose temper grew sharper with every degree the mercury dropped, and she had already spent more of her morning on sentiment than she could truly afford. She had no way of knowing that the ragged stranger she had just fed with her last coin was Julian Ashford, 9th Duke of Rothermere, the most eligible, most scrutinized, and most thoroughly disillusioned man in 3 counties, and that her single act of unthinking generosity had just altered the entire course of both their lives. Julian Ashford had not set out, 3 months earlier, to test the honesty of strangers by dressing as a beggar and wandering the roads of his own countryside. It had begun, as most follies do, with a betrayal so ordinary that no one else had thought it worth remarking upon. His father, the 8th Duke, had died the previous winter, leaving behind an estate heavier with debt than the family had ever publicly admitted, and a dowager duchess, Julian's grandmother, who had wasted no time informing her grandson that his grief was a luxury the family could not afford. There was a fortune to be secured. There was a name to be preserved. There was, above all, a suitable marriage to be arranged, and arranged quickly, before the creditors grew too bold and the gossip grew too loud. Julian had endured a season of introductions. Young ladies paraded before him in silk and pearls, each one reciting rehearsed compliments about his estate, his title, his eyes, his horses, in an order that suggested she had practiced the list beforehand and occasionally lost her place. He had watched them smile at footmen with contempt the moment they believed themselves unobserved. He had watched one particularly celebrated beauty, Miss Arabella Sutcliffe, step over a fallen flower girl in the street without so much as glancing down, and then turn to him, not 10 seconds later, with a radiant smile and a murmured compliment about his compassionate nature. Having heard, he contributed generously to the parish poor fund. It was Arabella, more than any other, who had planted the seed of Julian's disguise. Her family's fortune could clear his debts within a season. His grandmother favored the match openly and often, and Julian, watching her smile at him with such practiced warmth while her eyes remained as cold and assessing as a moneylender's, had found himself wondering, with something between despair and fury, whether there existed anywhere in England a single soul whose kindness was not, in the end, a performance for an audience worth impressing. His mother, dead these 12 years now, but never quite absent from his thoughts, had believed such kindness existed. She had shown it herself, quietly, without witnesses, to servants and tenants and strangers alike, and Julian remembered with painful clarity the day he had asked her, as a boy, why she troubled herself with people who could never repay her. Because kindness that expects payment is merely a transaction wearing a prettier coat, she had told him. The truest kindness is given to those who cannot see who gives it, and who could never repay it if they tried. He had not thought of those words in years. He thought of little else now, and so, in a fit of restless grief and mounting desperation, Julian had done something no duke before him had ever thought to attempt. He had taken his valet into his confidence, sworn the man to silence under threat of dismissal, and set out into his own countryside, dressed in the coat of a dead groundskeeper, his signet ring locked away in a strongbox, his fine boots exchanged for a pair so worn they let in water at the seams. He told himself he sought only information, a truer sense of his tenants, his lands, the people who might soon call Arabella Sutcliffe their Duchess. He told himself this was practical, strategic, the sort of thing a responsible landowner ought to do. He did not tell himself, not for many weeks, that what he truly sought was proof that his mother had not been a fool, that kindness without an audience still existed somewhere in this cold and calculating world. In 3 months of wandering, through villages, along frozen roads, into taverns where men spoke freely because they believed no one of consequence could hear them, Julian had found exactly what he expected to find. Doors closed in his face, coins withheld with muttered excuses. A vicar's wife who gave him a crust of bread and then spent the following half-hour ensuring several passing parishioners witnessed her doing so. He had begun, quietly and without quite admitting it to himself, to give up hope of finding what his mother had promised him existed. And then, in the market square of a village called Thornfield, on a morning so cold his borrowed coat had failed entirely to keep out the wind, a young woman in darned gloves had crossed the square, looked at him as though he were a person rather than an obstacle, and given him the last coin in her pocket, without asking his name, without waiting to be thanked, without so much as glancing back to see whether anyone had noticed her do it. Julian had stood by the churchyard wall for a long time after she left, turning her copper coin over in his fingers, feeling something crack open in his chest that he had thought long since sealed shut by grief and cynicism both. He did not yet know her name. He intended to learn it. It took him only 3 days to discover that the young woman's name was Clara Winslow, that she was 23, unmarried, and living under the roof of an aunt by marriage, a widow named Prudence Winslow, whose household in Thornfield was modest but respectable, and whose treatment of her niece, according to the gossip Julian gathered with unhurried patience in the village tavern, was considerably less generous than her circumstances required. Clara's father, he learned, had been a gentleman of moderate means who had died 3 years prior, his affairs discovered afterward to be in considerable disarray, debts he had concealed from his daughter out of pride, and which had consumed nearly the entirety of what should have been her inheritance. She had come to her aunt's household with little more than her clothing and her father's writing desk, and had been, in the years since, treated less as a beloved niece than as an unpaid companion, mending linens, managing accounts, tending to her aunt's frequent complaints of ill health, all in exchange for a roof and a grudging allowance that left nothing over for herself. She had, the tavern's gossips agreed, refused 2 offers of marriage in the past 2 years, a farmer with considerable land but a reputation for temper, and a widowed solicitor, twice her age, with 3 children already grown, and her aunt had not forgiven her for either refusal, considering Clara's continued unmarried state a burden she had not agreed to shoulder indefinitely. "She's a stubborn thing," one old woman had told Julian, not unkindly, over her mug of ale, believing him merely a curious stranger passing through. "Proud, for all she's poor as a church mouse, won't marry where she doesn't feel some regard, though heaven knows regard doesn't fill a larder, but she's good, mind. Sat up 3 nights running with my Sarah when the fever took her, and never asked a farthing for it, nor even a thank you, truth be told. Just came when she heard, and left before Sarah's mother could properly express her gratitude." Julian had listened to this with his grey eyes fixed on the fire, saying little, and had felt something settle in his chest with the quiet, absolute certainty of a door closing behind him. He knew, with a conviction that startled him in its suddenness, that he was not going to end this disguise as quickly as he had intended. He told himself, again, that this was merely further research. A duke owed it to his future duchess and his future tenants to understand the character of the people among whom he might settle, even a woman so far beneath his own station that the thought of anything beyond curiosity was, by every rule of his world, entirely absurd. He told himself this, and did not believe it even as he thought it, and the following morning he presented himself to the steward of the neighbouring estate, Ashcombe Park itself, though of course the steward did not recognize his own master beneath 3 months of unshaven wandering and borrowed clothes, and asked, in the rough voice he had cultivated for his disguise, whether there might be work for a man willing to labour in the gardens through the winter months. The steward, a practical man named Higgins, who had served the Ashford family for 2 decades and would have been appalled to learn he had just hired his own employer, looked Julian over with the assessing eye of a man accustomed to judging labourers, and said only, "You'll do. Gardener's cottage is empty since old Thomas passed. £half-crown a week and your keep. Mind you earn it." Julian took the position with a gravity that would have seemed absurd to anyone who understood what he was surrendering. Silk sheets and a French chef, the deference of 200 servants, the largest private library in the county, in exchange for a labourer's cottage and £half-a-crown a week. But he did not feel the surrender as loss. He felt it, strangely, as the first honest thing he had done in years. The gardener's cottage stood, he discovered with a satisfaction he chose not to examine too closely, less than half a mile from Prudence Winslow's modest house, along the lane that Clara walked each morning to the village and each evening back again. Their second meeting occurred 8 days after the first, on a lane thick with mud from a week of rain, when Clara came upon a cartwheel sunk to its axle and a labourer straining, without success, to free it alone. "You'll do your back an injury," she said, setting down her basket without ceremony and moving to the wheel's far side. "Here, if we lift together, on account." Julian, for it was of course Julian, though Clara knew him only as the ragged man from the market, now apparently employed at the great house, looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, something caught between astonishment and reluctance. "This is no work for a lady," he said. "I am no lady," Clara replied, already bracing her shoulder against the wheel's rim. "I am a woman with strong arms and very little patience for watching a man struggle when I might help. Now, 1, 2, 3. Between them, with considerable effort and a great deal of mud transferred to both their clothing, the wheel came free. Clara straightened, brushing ineffectually at her ruined skirt, and laughed. A genuine laugh, startled out of her by the absurdity of the moment, and Julian found himself staring at her as though he had never before heard the sound and did not entirely know what to do with the fact that he wished, quite fiercely, to hear it again. "You have my thanks," he said, and meant it more deeply than the simple words could convey. "You gave me nothing to be thanked for," Clara said, still smiling. "I helped because you needed help. That is the whole of the arithmetic." She paused, studying him with a curiosity she made no effort to disguise. "You're the new man at the park. Higgins mentioned you'd started." "I have," Julian said. "My name is—" He hesitated, and in that hesitation lay the first small crack in the foundation of what he was building, though he did not yet recognize it as such. "Julian," he said finally, offering only the truth of his given name, withholding everything else. "Julian Ash." It was not entirely a lie. It was, he told himself, merely an incomplete truth, the same incomplete truth every servant offered their employers, the same anonymity every labourer wore as armour against a world that valued them only for their usefulness. "Clara Winslow," she said, and extended a muddy hand as though he were a gentleman rather than a groundskeeper, an act of ordinary courtesy that struck Julian with disproportionate force, because he understood, even then, that most women of her limited means would not have troubled themselves with such a gesture toward a man they believed beneath them by every measure society recognized. She did not believe herself above him. That, more than anything else, was what undid him. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed with a frequency that Clara told herself was coincidence, and Julian knew, with increasing shame, was nothing of the sort. He arranged his gardening duties to bring him along the lane at the hour she walked to market. He volunteered for tasks at the small parish church that placed him within her orbit on Sundays. He learned, through careful and patient conversation, the small architecture of her days, that she rose before dawn to complete her aunt's mending before beginning her own work, that she kept a small garden of her own behind the cottage, where she grew herbs to sell quietly to the apothecary for coin her aunt did not know she possessed, that she had once dreamed of opening a small school for the village's poorer children, a dream she had folded away somewhere she believed it could not be reached again. "Why not pursue it?" Julian asked her one evening in early spring, as they sat on the low stone wall that separated the lane from the churchyard, the last light going gold and soft across the fields. He had taken, by then, to bringing her small things he could not afford, on a groundskeeper's wage, but managed nonetheless. A ribbon from the village shop, a book of poems he claimed to have found, though he had in fact ordered it from London under an assumed name, and waited 3 anxious weeks for its arrival. "Because dreams require capital," Clara said, with the dry practicality that had become, to Julian, one of her most captivating qualities, the way she named her own poverty without flinching from it, without performing either shame or false cheer for his benefit. "And I have none. My aunt controls what little remains of my father's estate until I marry, and she has made her opinion of my prospects for marriage quite plain." "What opinion is that?" "That I am too proud for a woman with nothing to be proud of." Clara said it lightly, but Julian saw the flicker of old hurt beneath the lightness, the particular ache of a wound revisited too many times to still draw fresh blood, though it drew something nonetheless. "She would have me marry Mr. Pruitt, the solicitor. He is not unkind. He would provide for me comfortably. And I cannot make myself want it, though I have tried, because I do not think comfort without regard is a bargain I wish to make, even knowing what refusing it costs me." "What does it cost you?" Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the light fade over the fields. "My aunt reminds me daily. My independence, such as it is, the certainty of a full larder in winter, perhaps, eventually, her patience entirely, and then, I do not know what becomes of me." She turned to look at him then, and there was something searching in her expression, something that made Julian's chest tighten with an emotion too complicated to name. "You must think me foolish, a woman with nothing, refusing security because it does not come wrapped in affection. I think," Julian said slowly, choosing each word with a care he rarely exercised even in matters of state, "that you are the least foolish person I have met in a very long time." Clara looked away first, her cheeks coloring in the fading light, and Julian understood, with a lurch of something that was equal parts joy and terror, that whatever was growing between them had ceased, some weeks past, to be merely an experiment in observing character. He was in love with her. He had been in love with her, he suspected, since the morning she pressed her last coin into a beggar's palm and walked away, without waiting for thanks, and every day since had been merely the slow, inevitable process of a man discovering a truth his heart had already settled upon before his mind consented to admit it. The trouble, and it was, he knew, a trouble of considerable magnitude, was that he had built the entire foundation of her regard upon a lie. The lie held for 4 months. It held through a mild winter and the slow greening of spring, through a dozen small kindnesses exchanged between the cottage and the lane, through an evening when Julian, as Julian Ash, groundskeeper, had intervened when a drunken farmhand cornered Clara outside the tavern and made insinuations no gentlewoman ought to endure, and had done so with a controlled, quiet ferocity that left the farmhand considerably more frightened than the physical altercation itself might have warranted, because something in Julian's bearing in that moment had suggested, however briefly, a man far more accustomed to command than any groundskeeper had cause to be. Clara had noticed. She had filed the observation away without examining it too closely, the way she had filed away a dozen other small inconsistencies, the elegance of his handwriting when he once wrote her a note, the way he sometimes referenced books no laborer would have had occasion to read, the faint, indefinable air of authority that clung to him even in his worn coat and his calloused hands. She had noticed, and had chosen, with the particular willful blindness of a woman falling in love against her own better judgment, not to inquire further. It was easier not to ask questions when the answers might take him from her. There were moments, in those 4 months, when the lie nearly broke on its own, without any letter to force its hand. One evening in April, Julian arrived at the churchyard wall to find Clara already seated there, her knees drawn up beneath her skirts, her face turned toward the last light, with an expression of such quiet unhappiness that he forgot, for a moment, every reason he had for caution. "My aunt has had another letter from Mr. Pruitt," she said, before he had even settled beside her. "He renews his offer. He says he is willing to wait no longer than the summer for my answer, and my aunt has informed me, in no uncertain terms, that she considers my continued refusal an indulgence she can no longer afford to support." She laughed, a small, unhappy sound. "She is not entirely wrong. I have no dowry, no prospects, and a school that exists only in my own imagining. What right have I to refuse a comfortable home merely because my heart does not leap at the thought of it?" "Every right," Julian said, with more heat than he intended, and Clara turned to look at him, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "You speak as though you have some stake in the matter." "I have every stake in the matter," Julian said, and the words rose in his throat unbidden, dangerously close to a confession he had not yet earned the right to make. He caught himself before it escaped him entirely, though the effort cost him something visible, something Clara noted, without yet understanding its source. "I speak only as a friend who does not wish to see you unhappy," he said instead, more carefully. "A marriage without regard is its own kind of poverty, whatever comforts it provides. I have observed enough of such marriages to know their cost." "You speak with unusual authority for a groundskeeper," Clara said, watching him with the particular sharpness she reserved for moments when his words did not quite match his station, and Julian felt the familiar cold drop of fear in his stomach, the fear that had visited him with increasing frequency as the weeks passed and the lie grew heavier to carry. "I have known men who married for fortune and regretted it their whole lives," he said, which was true enough to satisfy her, though it was not the whole of the truth, and he hated, in that moment, every incomplete answer he had ever given her. He did not tell her, that evening, who he truly was. He told himself it was not yet the right moment, that revealing himself too abruptly might frighten her, might make her feel, as she indeed would feel weeks later, that every tender word between them had been calculated rather than felt. He told himself a dozen reasons, and beneath every one of them lay the truth he could not quite face. He was afraid. Afraid that the moment she learned his rank, she would see him differently, not as Julian, who had knelt in the mud beside her, but as the Duke of Rothermere, a title she had been raised to regard with the particular wariness of the poor toward the powerful. He wanted, selfishly and completely, to be loved a little longer as simply a man, before he became, once again, merely a rank. It was a want that would cost them both a great deal before it was through. Word of Julian's continued absence from London had, in the meantime, begun to travel in circles considerably less forgiving than a village churchyard. Arabella Sutcliffe, informed by her own considerable network of correspondence that the Duke of Rothermere had not been seen at any fashionable gathering in nearly 4 months, had grown first impatient, then suspicious, and finally, upon receiving a letter from an acquaintance near Thornfield who mentioned, almost in passing, a curious new groundskeeper at Ashcombe Park with an oddly commanding bearing, dangerously certain. She did not yet know the whole truth, but she knew enough to write, with practiced sweetness and considerable underlying menace, to the Dowager Duchess, suggesting that perhaps it was time for her Grace to remind her grandson of his obligations before rumour did the family's reputation any lasting harm. The Dowager Duchess required no further persuasion. She had tolerated her grandson's absence through the winter out of respect for his grief, but 4 months of silence, coupled now with whispers of eccentric behaviour in the countryside, exceeded the limits of even a grandmother's patience. The lie held until the 2nd week of May, when a rider arrived at Ashcombe Park, bearing a letter from the Dowager Duchess, so urgent that Higgins the steward, upon reading the direction on the envelope, addressed not to himself, but to the Duke of Rothermere, care of Ashcombe Park, to be delivered by whatever means necessary, very nearly had an apoplexy on the spot, having spent 4 months believing his newest and most reliable groundskeeper to be nothing more than an itinerant labourer named Julian Ash. The truth could not, after that, remain hidden. Clara learned of it not from Julian himself, but from her aunt, 3 days later, in a manner calculated with a precision that suggested Prudence Winslow had waited with some relish for the perfect moment to deploy the information. "You will want to dress carefully for the Ashcombe ball," her aunt said, over a breakfast of thin porridge, her tone carrying the particular smugness she reserved for occasions when she believed herself to hold some advantage over her niece. "The Duke has returned to open the house properly at last, and Mrs. Farrow tells me the entire village is invited to the garden portion of the festivities, though of course only the gentry will see the ballroom itself. It seems the young Duke has been in residence rather longer than anyone realized, travelling incognito, if you can credit it, dressed as a common labourer, testing the character of his neighbours and tenants before he settled on his duchess. Quite the romantic tale, though I confess I find it rather an eccentric use of a man's time when there are estates to manage." She paused, buttering her bread with deliberate slowness. "Higgins says the man worked in the gardens here in Thornfield itself, not half a mile from this very house. Julian Ash, he called himself. Imagine that." Clara's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. The porridge in front of her blurred, and for a moment the kitchen seemed to tilt sideways, the walls too close, the air too thin to properly draw into her lungs. Julian Ash. Her Julian, the man who had helped her free a cartwheel from the mud, the man who had brought her a book of poems and sat with her on the churchyard wall as the light went gold across the fields, the man who had defended her outside the tavern with a fury that had, she now understood with sick and belated clarity, been the fury of a duke rather than the fury of a labourer. He was the Duke of Rothermere. He had been the Duke of Rothermere the entire time, through every conversation, every small kindness, every evening. She had allowed herself to believe, cautiously and then less cautiously, that perhaps the world contained one honest heart, willing to love her, without regard for what she could not offer. He had lied to her, not once, but every single day for 4 months, with every glance and every gentle word and every silence he had let her fill with her own trusting assumptions. And she had told him things she had told no one else, her father's shame, her fear of her aunt's growing impatience, her folded-away dream of a small school, spoken aloud to him alone in the fading light, because she had believed, with a foolishness that now made her stomach twist with humiliation, that he was safe to trust, precisely because he had nothing, no title, no fortune, no power to use her confessions against her. He had had all of those things. He had simply chosen to conceal them, and Clara understood, with the particular clarity that comes only after betrayal, exactly why a duke might wish to observe a poor woman's character, while she believed herself unwatched by anyone whose opinion could matter. He had been testing her. The thought arrived with the force of a physical blow. She had not been a person to him at all, not truly. She had been an experiment, a subject, a curiosity he had studied with the same detached interest a naturalist might apply to an unusual specimen of moth. Every tender word, every evening on the churchyard wall, every moment she had treasured as proof that the world was not entirely as cruel as her aunt's household had taught her to believe. All of it had been, quite possibly, nothing more than a duke's idle amusement, a diversion from the tedium of choosing a duchess, to be discarded now that the game had run its course, and the real business of his life required his attention once more. "You've gone quite pale," her aunt observed, without any particular concern. "I trust you're not entertaining foolish notions about the Duke's little masquerade, extending some special interest to yourself. He is to marry Miss Arabella Sutcliffe, I hear. The match has been all but settled these 6 months, her fortune being precisely what the Ashcombe estate requires. It would be a very great foolishness indeed for any woman in Thornfield to imagine herself of interest to a duke, whatever games he has been playing at in his gardening clothes." Clara said nothing. She set down her spoon with careful precision, folded her hands in her lap to still their sudden trembling, and excused herself from the table with a composure she did not remotely feel, walking with steady steps to her small room above the stairs, where she closed the door, sat upon the edge of her narrow bed, and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to weep without restraint. Julian came to the cottage lane that same evening, no longer in his groundskeeper's coat, but in the fine dark clothes of his true station, his carriage waiting discreetly at the crossroads, because he could not bear to arrive at her door in the trappings of the rank that had just, he knew with sick certainty, destroyed everything he had spent 4 months so carefully building. He found her in the small garden behind her aunt's house, kneeling among the herbs in the last of the evening light, and when she looked up and saw him, saw the fine coat, the polished boots, the unmistakable bearing of a man born to command that she had glimpsed 100 times without permitting herself to fully see it, her face went through a rapid succession of expressions that Julian would remember for the rest of his life, with a clarity approaching physical pain, shock, and then a terrible, dawning understanding, and then something that hurt him more than either, a swift, defensive shuttering, the closing of a door she had, he understood now, opened to him with enormous and hard-won trust, and which she was now closing against him with equally deliberate finality. "Your Grace," she said, and the formal address, spoken in a voice stripped of all its former warmth, struck Julian like a physical blow. "Clara, I think," she said, rising to her feet and brushing the soil from her skirt with hands that were not entirely steady, "that you had better explain yourself, though I confess I cannot imagine any explanation that would make this less than what it plainly is." "I did not set out to deceive you," Julian said, and heard, even as he spoke, how inadequate the words were against the weight of what he had actually done. "I set out. I had grown so weary, Clara, of a world that flatters me for my title and my fortune, and offers me nothing of itself in return, that I wished only to know whether kindness given without expectation of reward still existed anywhere. I did not know, when I began, that I would find you. I did not know that finding you would mean falling in love with you, and I did not know how to tell you the truth once I had, because I feared precisely this, that you would look at me exactly as you are looking at me now." "How am I looking at you?" Clara asked, though her voice trembled on the question, and Julian understood she already knew the answer. "As though I have made you a fool," he said quietly, "as though every tender word I ever spoke to you was calculated rather than felt. And I cannot prove to you that it was not calculated, Clara. I can only tell you that it was not, and ask you to believe me, though I have given you every reason not to. You tested me," Clara said, and now the tears she had been holding back all evening broke free, sliding hot down her cold cheeks. "You watched me give you my last coin and thought, what? That you had found your specimen, that you would observe me, as one observes an insect under glass, to see whether my kindness held up under sufficient scrutiny." "No," Julian said, with a fierceness that startled them both. "I watched you give me your last coin and felt something break open in my chest that I had believed permanently sealed. I did not think of you as a specimen, Clara, not for one single day after that morning in the market square. I thought of you as the answer to a question I had nearly given up hope of ever having answered, the question of whether my mother had been right, whether real kindness, freely given, still existed in this world. You are that answer. You have always been that answer. I simply lacked the courage, for far too long, to tell you so honestly." "And what of Miss Sutcliffe?" Clara asked, her voice breaking on the name. "My aunt tells me you are to marry her, that the match has been settled these 6 months. Was I merely your amusement then, while the true business of your life proceeded elsewhere without my knowledge?" Julian closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, the pain in his expression was unmistakable, unguarded, in a way Clara had never seen from him, even in their most intimate conversations. "There has been pressure from my grandmother to secure that match, yes. There have been 6 months of expectation that I would do precisely what every duke before me has done, marry for fortune and consequence, and call the resulting arrangement a triumph, regardless of what it costs the heart. I have not signed any settlement, Clara. I have not offered for her hand. I have delayed and delayed, and I understand now, standing before you, precisely why I could not bring myself to commit to a match with a woman I do not love, when I had already, without permitting myself to fully acknowledge it, given my heart elsewhere." "Given it to a lie," Clara said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier fury, replaced by something more exhausted, more genuinely wounded. "You gave your heart to Clara Winslow while wearing the face of Julian Ash, and I do not know, Your Grace, how a woman is meant to trust that the affection was ever truly meant for her, and not for the fantasy of a simple life you could abandon the moment it grew inconvenient." "Then let me prove it," Julian said. "Give me the chance to prove it, Clara. Not with words. Words are cheap, and I have already spent too many of them on deception, however unintentional. Let me prove it with action, with time, with whatever patience you require of me. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I am asking you not to close the door entirely." Clara looked at him for a long moment, the last light fading from the sky behind him, and Julian saw, in the depths of her red-rimmed eyes, a war being fought between the hope she could not entirely extinguish and the hurt that told her hope was a luxury she had already paid too dearly for once before, when her father's death had taught her exactly how quickly comfortable certainties could collapse into ruin. "I need time, Your Grace," she said finally, "more than tonight can give me. I need to know whether the man I gave my heart to in that cottage lane is real, or whether he was only ever a mask you wore because the truth of your own life had grown too heavy to bear alone. And I do not think you can prove that to me with a single conversation in a herb garden at dusk." "Then I will wait," Julian said. "As long as it takes. I have waited my whole life, Clara, without knowing it, for a woman who would love me for something other than my title, and now that I have found her, I do not intend to lose her through impatience." Clara did not answer. She turned and walked back into the house, and Julian stood alone in the darkening garden for a long time afterward, feeling the full weight of what his deception, however well-intentioned, had cost them both. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult of Clara's life, though not, as she might once have expected, because of any dramatic confrontation. Julian did not press her. He did not appear again at the cottage lane, did not send letters demanding her forgiveness, did not attempt any of the grand romantic gestures that a lesser man, in his position, might have employed to overwhelm rather than persuade. Instead, he did something far more difficult and far more effective. He waited, visibly and patiently, in a manner the entire village soon came to notice and discuss. He paid off, quietly and without announcement, the remaining debts of Clara's late father. Debts Clara had not known persisted, small obligations to local tradesmen that her aunt had concealed from her for years out of some combination of pride and control, and which Julian's steward discovered and settled without ever revealing the source of the payment, so that Clara heard of it only when the village baker mentioned, in passing, that her father's old account had been settled in full by an anonymous benefactor. She knew, without being told, precisely who that benefactor was. He did not attend the same church services she attended, out of consideration for her comfort, but he ensured, through careful and unobtrusive arrangement, that the small school she had once dreamed of establishing received an anonymous endowment sufficient to secure a building and a schoolmistress's modest salary for 5 years, though the letter accompanying the endowment specified, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that the position of schoolmistress was reserved, should she wish to accept it, for Miss Clara Winslow, and for no one else. Clara stood in the small stone building that would become her school, reading that letter with hands that shook, and felt something in her carefully guarded heart begin, despite every instinct toward caution, to soften. It was not the money that moved her, though the money mattered enormously to a woman who had spent 3 years counting coins in a frozen market square. It was the specificity of the gift, the fact that Julian had not simply thrown wealth at the problem of his guilt, but had listened, truly listened, months before, to a single conversation on a churchyard wall about a dream she had folded away and believed forgotten, and had remembered every detail of it well enough to make that dream real. It was proof, however imperfect, that the man in the cottage lane had been real after all. In the days before the ball, Clara found herself standing often before the small spotted mirror in her room, studying her own reflection with an honesty she usually avoided. She was not, she knew, a beauty in the fashion the London papers celebrated. Her nose was a shade too sharp, her hands roughened by years of mending and gardening, her gowns mended so many times the original fabric barely showed beneath the careful stitches. She thought of Arabella Sutcliffe's peach silk and polished pearls, and felt the old, familiar ache of a woman who had spent her whole life standing at the edges of rooms where prettier women stood at the center. But she thought, too, of the schoolhouse with its dozen empty desks awaiting September, of her father's debts quietly settled by a man who had asked nothing in return, of a groundskeeper's steady hands freeing a cartwheel from the mud without a single complaint about the state of his boots. She thought of every small honesty Julian had shown her, even while concealing the largest one, and she understood, turning from the mirror at last, that whatever came of the ball, she did not intend to spend the rest of her life believing herself unworthy of being chosen, simply because she had once been overlooked. I gave my last coin to a stranger because I believed he deserved kindness, regardless of what he could give me in return, she told her reflection quietly. I will not now refuse the same grace to myself. It was, she thought, the bravest decision she had made since her father died, braver, in its way, than any of the small daily courages that had carried her through 3 years of her aunt's cold household, because it required her to risk not merely comfort, but hope itself, and hope, she had learned early and painfully, was the costliest thing a poor woman could ever permit herself to spend. She dressed the following evening in her best gown all the same, and walked to Ashcombe Park with her chin lifted, telling herself that whatever the night brought, she would not meet it with her eyes lowered. The true test came in June, at the ball Julian's grandmother had insisted upon holding to formally announce his return to society and, the Dowager Duchess fully intended, his betrothal to Arabella Sutcliffe. Clara had not intended to attend even the garden portion of the festivities open to the village, but her aunt, sensing an opportunity to display whatever tenuous connection the household might claim to the Duke's recent notoriety, and perhaps hoping to remind her niece publicly of precisely how far beneath the Ashcombe family's notice she truly stood, insisted upon it with a firmness that brooked no refusal. Clara wore her best gown, faded but carefully mended, and stood at the edge of the torchlit garden watching the great and glittering assembly move through the grounds of Ashcombe Park, feeling smaller and more invisible with every passing moment. She watched Arabella Sutcliffe, resplendent in silk the color of ripe peaches, moving through the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent her entire life being admired, and felt the old, familiar ache of comparison settle over her, the same ache she had felt her whole life, beside prettier, wealthier, more confident women, the ache that had convinced her, long before Julian's deception compounded it, that women like herself were simply not meant for happy endings. She was preparing to slip away unnoticed, to walk home alone in the dark, rather than endure another moment of watching the life that might have been hers paraded so glitteringly before her, when a commotion near the ballroom's open doors drew the crowd's attention, and Clara, despite herself, turned to look. Julian stood in the doorway, resplendent in formal dress that could not disguise, even now, the same steady bearing she had first glimpsed beneath his groundskeeper's coat. Beside him stood the Dowager Duchess, her expression thunderous, and Arabella Sutcliffe, her painted smile beginning, visibly, to crack at the edges. "I have called this assembly together," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent garden, "to correct a misunderstanding that has, I am told, circulated rather widely in recent weeks. There has been no betrothal settled between myself and Miss Sutcliffe. There will be none. I regret any expectation my grandmother's enthusiasm may have created, but I will not build my marriage upon a foundation of fortune alone, when I have already, this spring, discovered what a foundation of genuine regard might offer instead." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Arabella's smile vanished entirely, replaced by something considerably less composed. The Dowager Duchess opened her mouth to protest, and closed it again at the look her grandson gave her. A look Clara, watching from the garden's edge with her heart climbing into her throat, had never before seen him wear, though she recognized in it, suddenly and completely, the authority of a man who had spent 4 months pretending not to possess it. "Some months ago," Julian continued, his grey eyes moving across the crowd until they found Clara's, standing pale and still at the garden's edge, "a woman gave the last coin in her possession to a stranger she believed to be a beggar, expecting nothing in return, not thanks, not recognition, not reward. She did not know that stranger's name, or rank, or fortune. She knew only that he was cold, and she had the means, however slight, to warm him, and that knowledge was sufficient to move her to generosity most people in her position could not have afforded to extend. I have spent every day since attempting to prove myself worthy of that generosity, and I do not know that I have yet succeeded. But I intend to spend a great many more days trying, if she will permit it, because I have never in my life met anyone whose heart was so entirely without artifice, and I do not intend to lose her now through cowardice, having already lost her once through concealment." Every eye in the garden turned toward Clara. She stood frozen at the edge of the torchlight, her worn but carefully mended gown suddenly the object of scrutiny from every gentry family in 3 counties, her aunt beside her, gone rigid with a shock that would, Clara suspected, transform rapidly into calculation the moment the crowd's attention shifted elsewhere. She felt the old instinct to disappear, to shrink from every eye now fixed upon her, war fiercely with something new, something that had been growing quietly within her through the long weeks of Julian's patient, unglamorous proof, something that looked very much like courage. She walked forward. It took every measure of will she possessed to cross that garden with the whole of Ashcombe society watching, her mended gown and her darned gloves and her 3 years of careful invisibility all exposed at once to eyes that had never before troubled to look at her directly. But she walked because the alternative, turning away, retreating once more into the safety of being overlooked, no longer felt like safety at all. It felt, she realized with sudden and startling clarity, like the same fear that had kept her father from asking for help until it was too late, the same fear her aunt had used for 3 years to keep her small and grateful and afraid to want more than what she was given. She had given her last coin to a stranger without hesitation, because kindness had never frightened her. She would not let hope frighten her now. "You are a duke," she said, stopping before him, her voice steadier than she had believed it capable of being. "And I am a woman with a mended gown and no fortune to speak of. You are the woman who taught me that kindness given without an audience is the only kindness worth trusting," Julian said. "I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who valued my title above everything else I might be. I do not wish to spend the rest of it that way. I wish to spend it with someone who valued me before she knew I had a title at all. And if I say I cannot forgive the deception, however well it has turned out, then I will accept that answer, Julian said, and Clara heard, beneath the steadiness of his voice, the genuine fear that his answer might be true. And I will not trouble you again, though it will cost me more than you can know. I would rather lose you honestly than keep you through further deception of any kind. Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had knelt in the mud beside her to free a cartwheel, who had remembered a folded-away dream well enough to make it real, who stood now before the whole of his society and named her, publicly and without qualification, as the woman he loved, knowing full well what scandal and gossip such a declaration would invite. "I forgave you weeks ago," she said quietly, "the moment I understood that a duke does not endow a schoolhouse for a woman he intends merely to amuse himself with and discard. I have simply been waiting to see whether you would have the courage to say so before witnesses, rather than only in a darkened garden where no one else could hold you to it." Something in Julian's expression broke open then, relief and joy so plainly visible that several of the assembled guests, watching, felt their own eyes unexpectedly grow damp, though most would have denied it fiercely the following morning. "Clara Winslow," he said, taking her darned gloved hand in both of his own, heedless of who watched, "will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Not because I am a duke and you require security, but because I love you more completely than I have ever loved anything in my life, and I would rather spend that life poor and beside you than wealthy and without you, though I am gratified we need not actually choose between the two." Clara laughed, the same startled, genuine laugh he had first heard beside the sunken cartwheel, the sound that had undone him from the very beginning, and said, "Yes, Your Grace, though I hope you understand that I intend to keep teaching at my school, regardless of what your grandmother thinks a duchess ought properly to do with her time." "I would expect nothing less," Julian said, and kissed her hand with a reverence that drew a soft, collective sigh from the watching crowd. "And I intend to endow a dozen more schools across every estate I hold, if it means watching you teach even one more child to read with the same devotion you once showed a beggar in a frozen market square." They were married that autumn, in the small stone church at Thornfield, rather than the grander cathedral the Dowager Duchess had initially proposed, because Clara had asked for it quietly, and Julian had granted it without hesitation, understanding that some things mattered more than spectacle. Prudence Winslow attended, considerably more deferential than she had ever previously managed toward her niece, though Clara, generous even in her triumph, made certain her aunt's remaining years were provided for comfortably, unwilling to let old resentments curdle into cruelty of her own making. Arabella Sutcliffe married, within the year, a viscount of considerable fortune and considerably less discernment, and told her acquaintances, whenever the subject arose, that she had never truly wanted the Duke of Rothermere in any case. The village schoolhouse opened its doors the following spring, and Clara stood before its first class of a dozen children, farmers' sons and daughters, the offspring of tradesmen and labourers, children who might otherwise never have learned to read a single word, with a joy so complete it sometimes still startled her, this late, hard-won proof that generosity given without expectation of reward could, in the fullness of time, return to the giver 100-fold. Julian came often to watch her teach, standing quietly in the schoolhouse doorway, in clothes considerably plainer than his rank required, and Clara would sometimes catch him there, watching her with the same grey-eyed intensity he had first turned on her in a market square years before, and she understood, every single time, that the man she had married was precisely the same man who had knelt in the mud to thank her for a coin she could not spare, that the disguise had fallen away entirely, but the heart beneath it had never once been false. "You are staring again," she would tell him, and he would smile the rare, unguarded smile he showed to no one else in the world. "I am simply making certain," he would answer, every time, that I have not merely dreamed you. And Clara, who had once believed herself too poor, too plain, too overlooked for any such happiness, would cross the schoolroom to take his hand, and would think, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had finally learned to trust what her own heart had known from the very beginning, that kindness, freely given, without thought of reward, to a stranger who seemed to have nothing at all to offer in return, had turned out, in the end, to be the richest coin she had ever spent.